Andy Dalton had the first 300-yard, 3-touchdown game of 2024. Deontay Johnson is back. Malik Neighbors continues to absolutely smash. Jawan Jennings had a game for the ages. We're going to talk about everything we saw on Sunday of week 3. This is Stealing Bananas on the Stealing Siegele's YouTube. Let's go. Welcome in, everybody. Welcome in, Shawn. We jump scared some of the people waiting in the background when I hit live there a little bit ahead of time. So we're gonna go live when the Sunday night game ends. This was scheduled for 11:30 Eastern, 8:30 Pacific, as it has been each of the few weeks. But this Sunday night game got done a little early, so we are ready to roll. How you doing, Shawn?
Good. Kansas City Chiefs come through at the end. I don't know if you can really say they look like the best team in football, but they are back-to-back champions and now 3-0. A team like the Baltimore Ravens that completely controlled their game today and is maybe the closest competitor, still almost lost for the third time. Then we had a lot of garbage time for the Cowboys after that onside kick. It flipped back from garbage time into this is an important part of the game time. So that was interesting to see in a 2024 season where passing yards are hard to come by. Teams that can actually function in garbage time are a lot of fun, especially if they recover an onside kick and pull the game back. We had not exactly a shootout, but a fantastic game between the Lions and Cardinals. Still, I think, two of the best teams. Anyone who is an Arizona Diamondbacks fan, which is sort of an out of nowhere note here to start this off, will not be that surprised that during the Cardinals game today, the Detroit Lions fans seem to be controlling the culture there inside Arizona Cardinals Stadium. That's something that we do have sometimes out here in the desert. Lots of people who are transplants. Then the coolest game of the day did come from Andy Dalton and the Carolina Panthers. Your pick of Deontay Johnson, as soon as we got a real quarterback in there. And I say that strongly believing that Bryce Young can eventually have his Geno Smith moment somewhere down the line. One of the things I think that jumped out pretty strongly today, even though there were some guys who did light it up in garbage time. Think about, vaguely garbage time-ish type of play. Caleb Williams put up some stats, even though he, again, played very poorly. It's tough out there right now, I think, for the young QBs. But Deontay Johnson, the 14 targets, he has a huge game with the 8 catches, 122 yards, a touchdown. He could have easily had a couple of more touchdowns. One time he comes wide open in the end zone toward the end of that game, but there was an unblocked rusher, and not surprisingly, Dalton had to sail that one just to kind of protect himself. Deontay Johnson, though, looked very, very good. And Andy Dalton, it's one game against a Raiders team that I do believe lost a key defensive piece going in. This does make the Ravens' loss last week to the Raiders look a lot worse. They look like they're going to be one of the worst teams in football. But you put him in the right situation, Andy Dalton can move the ball up and down the field. We were talking to Ryan Fitzpatrick. I mentioned to you that I added him onto all of my Superflex rosters. This was a fun game.
Yeah, he looked fantastic. The Deontay Johnson thesis was what I thought it would be, right? A lot of targets. No one else on the team had more than 5. He had 14. He earns volume. He has at all stages of his career. He did at Toledo, right? The targets per run in college, I always like to reference, were massive. He did immediately in the NFL. Last year, his per game numbers were down a little bit, but that was because he had several games where he didn't play the full snaps, but the per route stuff was still very strong last year. It's been down a little bit the last 2 years over like 2021, when I think that was his best year. But still like a clear, dominant target earner that they brought in. And Dave Canales was talking about this offseason, like we're looking for where he's at on the field on all of our pass plays. Like he's the guy we're building our pass offense around, like he kind of did with Mike Evans last year in Tampa. that's what we saw today. We didn't see that last week because Bryce Young had a 2.96 ADOT. Like, if he's not even going to throw the ball down the field, that's kind of a problem. This offense was non-functional before, right? And so I'm not saying it was obvious that Andy Dalton's going to come in and throw for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns, but I did take Carolina +6 and the over in this game over at Stealing Lions, which both hit by a mile, because there was the possibility that a veteran quarterback could come in here and actually make this offense functional. Going from completely non-functional to functional changes a lot of stuff, right? And then also the Panthers not being a good defense and some of these other elements were going to help there be some points in this game. At least that was the theory. It did work out that way. But yeah, Johnson, huge beneficiary there. And going forward, I mean, it looks like a guy who's going to get plenty of volume because he gets open, he runs good routes. And it really just with him always comes down to efficiency, but he was pretty darn efficient today as well. So that was fantastic. Shawn, I was just looking at our guillotine team. I famously overbid for Mark Andrews relative to your expectations. Kind of last minute. We hadn't chatted. We have Cole Kmet on the bench. She had 25.7 points. Mark Andrews had 0 in our lineup, but we are going to get through. So I'm really glad that that's not going to cost us this week. We are going to advance with Garrett Wilson, Stephon Diggs, Aaron Jones, and then we have 4 more players tomorrow night, but already we need about 0.6 points to advance, and we have 4 players. So, yeah, we are in strong position. How do you feel about Mark Andrews right now?
Well, we were on slightly different pages there with the bid. It was interesting to see the Ravens come out today and do what I think, they're going to want to do in most games. They did a little bit of this last season as well, where you come out, you got the new offensive coordinator, you do like your weapons, you throw a lot of balls around the line of scrimmage to Zay Flowers. Some of that's successful, some isn't. As someone who really likes Zay Flowers and had him in some lineups today, that game is pretty frustrating, but that's really what we expected. And Derrick Henry looked very, very good. I guess it's not a huge surprise that it would take a few games to figure out exactly the types of play calls that are going to work with the two of them together. But that is something that we saw today, where the Cowboys were unable to stop Henry. They were unable to stop Lamar Jackson when he kept the ball and ran. They played off of each other extremely well. The Dallas Cowboys defense looks like it's going to be pretty exploitable, which I'm sure is a disappointment for them considering the talent they have, at least in theory, on that side of the ball. But you mentioned Cole Kmet, somebody I wrote up a number of times this season saying, look, this guy outscored a bunch of people that you probably don't realize he outscored last year. He was very, very good. He had the breakout. He's big. He's athletic. They're going to need that in the offense. The focal point for the Colts certainly seemed to be making sure DJ Moore didn't beat them, and he didn't. And they won the game. So, those things perhaps work together. But when you're drawing it up, you're probably not expecting to give up the big plays to Rome Odunze. He's someone where I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. I'll be interested to see what the final numbers are. He had 11 targets, only catches the 6 because some of their targets were way, way, way off. But he will be one of these guys who looks good both in terms of his actual score and then what people are going to say in terms of some of the unrealized volume, because there were some serious air yards on those plays.
There were some chances for him to go big. We did play him. One of our probably 2 or 3 biggest decisions of the week, Shawn, came down to the wire. We always do some talk on Sunday morning. We had him versus Jaden Reed, who you obviously love. I kind of said, I'm gonna wear this one. And most of them I defer to you, but I was like, I'm gonna wear this one and say we got to go with the Odunze on this with Malik Wilson there. Reed looked great again. Odunze, fortunately for me, that I'm not going to be banished to backup start-sit decision-making going forward. Fortunately for me, Odunze did come through on the hope and the expectation that he would have a really strong game here, one of his big first good games as a rookie, right? This was the opportunity. It seemed pretty clear against a bad Colts defense that they could get something going. It was so funny to me. The first big play to him was a 1st and 10 play action where Caleb Williams gets a little bit of a clean pocket. There does end up being a little bit of pressure. He steps up in the pocket, throws a really nice deep ball to Rome Odunze. I tweeted it out. I was like, that's how good offenses are designed. Non-obvious passing down, play action, give the guy a little bit of a clean pocket by not making it so obvious that this is, going to be a drop back like they're doing on every other play. And he finds an open Odunze and makes a nice throw. And I mean, Shane Waldron should have been fired before he was hired, but he should be fired tomorrow. You cannot go into this game. Both the teams that played the Colts in weeks 1 and 2 had quarterbacks that had at least a 115 passer rating and a lead running back that had at least 150 rush yards. The Bears didn't score a point in the first half against that defense. It was embarrassing.
And I mean, it was bad, right? So when you look at the final numbers and you're thinking that's pretty good. This is a game where Caleb Williams threw the ball 52 times. We had a couple of games like this today where there was a massive split between one side and the other. Anthony Richardson only 20. And partly you get the 52 times because Anthony Richardson cannot pick up a first down because he can't complete a pass to basically anybody. But the Bears weren't able to take advantage of that. You get you get the 4 sacks, you get the couple of interceptions, you get the fumble. As you mentioned, this Indianapolis Colts defense looks like one of the worst in the NFL, and they do end up giving up a lot of yards in the end. But as you mentioned, the Bears looked like they had absolutely no idea what they wanted to do in the first half. It's still really exciting to see what they were able to do from a compiling perspective, because from fantasy football, I mean, that's what we really want. It was a weird game today because Caleb Williams showed almost no pocket awareness, which I thought was really surprising given how many games he played in college, how successful he was in college, the fact that he was able to kind of manage the scramble elements fairly well in college. I mean, there were some like tiny red flags. That's going to mostly be the case for anybody who plays as many games as he played and is under that much of a microscope. I was disappointed that he didn't seem to understand where the rushers were, where his guys were coming open. And yet at the same time, you saw the competitiveness. And I mean, watching tonight's game and how bad Patrick Mahomes looked again. I mean, certainly the Chiefs, like I said, 3-0, they did some good things. Rashee Rice, a fantastic game. Everything else really on their offense looks broken. And Mahomes looks kind of lost. When we're in a situation where he looks lost, it's not going to be surprising when other guys do as well. The thing that just kept jumping out, though, and one of the reasons that these 52 passes became pretty fun, where you get the massive game for Odunze, the massive game for Cole Kmet, the ball comes off of Caleb Williams' hand completely different than virtually any other quarterback in the NFL. If they can at some point put together a legitimate NFL offensive scheme, it should be really fun. I mean, that dude is absolutely crazy.
Shawn, we were having these conversations with a young Justin Fields, feeling like he could throw so accurately down the field when he was protected. Obviously, he has some issues with sacks and those things. The Bears just did this. They hired Matt Nagy, and they did a horrible job of surrounding their young first-round pick quarterback with a good scheme and smart coaching. And they just are doing it again with the next guy. Learn a lesson in your organization.
Right. I do think that that's completely and totally true. I was thinking as I watched this first half, like, can we get a mid-game firing? It looked really, really bad. At the same time, lots of teams are struggling. Lots of coaches who looked pretty decent last year are struggling. CJ Stroud and the Houston Texans, I mean, it's hard to really articulate or express how lost they looked and how completely and totally overmatched they were by the Minnesota Vikings. And that's a situation where CJ Stroud last year had one of the greatest rookie seasons ever. And part of that credit was given to the coaching staff and the offensive coordinator in the things that they brought. And then you have that game today, and I mean, it's almost back to square one for them. They have a lot of work to do just to be competent, not to be explosive like we hoped a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, that was a bummer. Couple stats and other things you mentioned. You mentioned the Ravens. I wanted to note 15 pass attempts is all today. That's part of the Andrews thing, although I saw he only played about 33% of the snaps, which is a huge thing I'm confused about and interested in diving into a little bit more when I read up Stealing Signals. 45 rushes against 15 passes for them. You mentioned Henry and Jackson playing off each other. 14 Lamar Jackson runs, 25 Derrick Henry runs. They combined for 238 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns. That's how the Ravens got there today. And they really dominated. It was 28-6, but they gave up 19 points late, as you mentioned. I Another thing I wanted to mention, the chat, James in the chat said, just getting in here, if you guys reviewed the Steelers game yet, I just found that funny from the perspective of it was the lowest over-under game. It was about a 35 over-under, and it still went under. It's these two very run-heavy offenses. It's not the game that I would have thought that somebody would have popped into the chat, but like, if you guys reviewed that yet, that is one of the games that Shawn has not been able to get to yet. Also, the Giants, Cleveland, Miami, Seattle, and the Rams and Niners you sent to me, Shawn. So we probably won't talk about those games a ton, as we have talked every week. Shawn watches these games individually. I try to watch them all at the same time. I've caught bits and pieces of all the games. He's caught more of the games he has watched, but fewer of the games. And so we tend to talk about the ones that we both have full understanding of. Tyler with a great comment here as well. Hit the like and subscribe. If you guys are hanging out, always appreciate that. And the other thing I wanted to hit in the chat before we get going too far is this guy, Shawn. Malik Neighbors, from our guy Billy Jones here. Malik Neighbors is pretty incredible. That catch in the back of the end zone, I tweeted, I don't know if there's 10 other receivers that make that catch. When I saw it again, I was like, I don't know if there's 10 other receivers that have the audacity to try to make that catch. How many guys don't even like really necessarily go up for that? It's up and behind him. It's a Daniel Jones throw, and Malik Neighbors makes it right because he's a freaking acrobat. I mean, that was incredible.
Yeah, so I haven't seen that one, but
it
makes me very, very excited, right? And
that's one of the games you haven't seen. I just read all the games.
One of the things I think that anybody who gets a call right should just victory lap it whenever they do, because then the following week there's no guarantee. Enjoy things when they are happening. One of the things that I felt pretty strongly about this offseason was that statistically Malik Neighbors was not that comparable to Marvin Harrison in that he was just clearly better. Now, when we're taking things from college and you think about some of the things that he was surrounded by, certainly we think that Brian Thomas is probably pretty good. Jaden Daniels is the one young QB who's looked pretty good through a couple weeks, although he's mostly just throwing horizontal passes to the running backs and then running, but he's run well, which we like to see. But Malik Neighbors does just seem like something else. And I do think you've got to accomplish some things before you get put with CeeDee Lamb and Justin Jefferson, or certainly ahead of those guys.
But you haven't seen the game today yet, so let's just caveat it.
Well,
because he accomplished some things today. 18 targets in week 2. You watched that game. Today's game was more impressive.
I had him as the number 3 overall receiver this week in my updated dynasty rankings.
So you already had him there, is what you were saying. He may be wide receiver 1 after today's games when Shawn gets caught up on that. I apologize for throwing something at you that you haven't had a chance to necessarily watch yet, but he looked fantastic today. It was great to see. I saw a tweet after the game. He got plenty of volume that he, I can't remember who it was from, but he's on pace for like 200 something targets was the tweet. And I don't even remember the number. I just saw it briefly during that game.
Well, we were certainly trying to get him on teams.
And that's where I was going to go with that, because you mentioned pre-draft, you were Neighbors over Harrison, and I kind of gave you some grief about it. You were overthinking it, this, that, and the other thing. After the draft, when I got through my projections is when I finally kind of got on board with that a little bit with you and started thinking that way. And we did definitely try to get him on a lot of teams, because when we went through the projection process, same thing. You felt like they were going to build this whole offense out of him. When we talked about Harrison last week, you mentioned it. There's going to probably be some volume issues here sometimes, although they went to Harrison a lot today.
We got a lot of Michael Wilson today.
Got a lot of Michael Wilson. Yeah. And McBride, not necessarily, like, it felt like maybe a little more defensive attention. Then he gets a concussion later. It seemed like a concussion, which was unfortunate. Took a big hit to the head and left. But Neighbors looks like Harrison looks like he's going to have games like he had today where he gets 11 targets, and he's going to have games like he had last week where he's really efficient, and he's going to have some great production. Neighbors looks like they literally have a call sheet that's just throw to Malik, and that's just all of that. You know what I mean? It's the old Randy ratio.
I mean, that's what you want to see, and that is the thing that becomes so frustrating with so many of these teams, where you get a defensive look where the defense is like, this is your best player. We're going to put somebody over the top. We're going to make sure that we hit him at the line, and the quarterback and the offensive coordinator is like, you know what we should do is we should use that to get our other guys involved. No, Don't do that. Just keep throwing the ball to Malik Neighbors. And if you have anybody who's remotely similar, throw the ball to them. One of the things that I did think was going to happen this year is that we would get that from the Giants. And again, I haven't seen this game. The Cleveland Browns are awful, but maybe still have a good defense. If he could stay healthy, I thought that Daniel Jones would be good enough to make this thesis work. Now, that doesn't mean good, right? But good enough. And if you have someone...
I don't even think he needs to be good enough. I thought he was bad today, and Malik Neighbors just continuously makes it okay. It's crazy. You're going to enjoy watching it. I'm sorry to...
No, I mean, I'm excited for that game. When it started, there was the catch to... you had the early, I believe, turnover, and then you had the throw-up catch to Amari Cooper, which, again, it's kind of interesting because that one is confirmed. I like it. I don't like it for Amari Cooper, but I like it in general that now we're defaulting to let scores count. That, I think, is fantastic.
That was like the last highlight for the Browns. They didn't do anything. I saw a tweet also, and again, I don't know who it was. There's a lot of stuff that goes through my head on Sundays. I apologize to whoever is sending these great tweets. But there was a tweet, another one, and I know these are both sharp accounts, and I can't remember exactly which ones. One of them might have been Danny Kelly from The Ringer. The Browns are the least efficient. This is the least efficient, I think, pass efficiency the Browns have been since 2000 as a team through 3 games. So Deshaun Watson has quarterbacked the least efficient version of the Cleveland Browns, right? Like how many since 2000? So like remember the Tim Couch through whoever, like all the fans wearing the jerseys that have all the names on it, all those guys that have played for them, all the bad offenses they've had. This is the worst one that they've had as far as, through 3 games.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I was looking here at Marvin Harrison, who, again, did have a pretty good game. Seemed like he was getting open more comfortably today. Drew the 11 targets, as you mentioned. There were 9 to Michael Wilson. It was interesting that with a long of only 17, that the 5 for 64 still gives him, not a good average, but when you consider how many of the throws these days are underneath, he did have a long end zone target that was ended up being kind of Anthony Richardson-esque in that it was more of a punt. It was underthrown into double coverage. You'd like to see that one he's so big and athletic, throw it make sure that's across the 2 guys who are defending him, and it can be a little bit more like, Ben, what were your thoughts on DJ Moore catching the Hail Mary, but it not going for a touchdown?
I don't know. I didn't have strong thoughts. I was like, all right, well, that's a nice boost to the DJ Moore. I kind of wanted it to go for a TD. I don't know. I also was like, you know what? This is the best play that Shane Waldron's dialed up the whole first half. Like, is a Hail Mary. I had a lot of thoughts. I love that you casually threw in there, like, Anthony Richardson's now a descriptor for
just throwing up punts.
What was that interception where he decided to do a jump pass? He stepped up in the pocket, decided to do a jump pass, and he had like an out and a deeper corner, and there's a defender in between. There's an open receiver 5 yards in front and behind, and he hits the defender right in the chest. Not even like making him move. Set your feet, right? Like, where are the fundamentals? That was the first play of the second half. Just came out and threw the ball right to a defender. Wasn't his only bad throw.
Travis May, who obviously one of my good friends, and I think very highly of in terms of his college football acumen, has told me on multiple occasions that Anthony Richardson was the worst underneath an intermediate thrower that he's ever seen. The only person who statistically, not similarly bad, but also had the terrible numbers coming in was Will Levis. He actually looked pretty good today outside of the really bad pick six.
Outside of the really bad pick six is the caveat. But yeah, he did make some good throws.
But I did want to mention the Trey McBride play because this was an interesting one. First of all, another very disappointing game for him. He did make a catch late. He's extremely physical. He was trying to run with the ball. This is the one that was my understanding is actually an offensive penalty where he gets down,
lowers his head,
and more or less spears the defensive guy who also looked like he was injured on the play.
I think they may have both gotten concussions. Yeah, it did not look good.
Yeah. So hopefully, just again, as we continue to have education on all of the things for the players, we can get those plays out. I mean, nobody wants to take a brutal hit, to the knees or the quads, but that's a play that's just going to hurt both players. The play that I thought was super dirty, even though it wasn't flagged, because not even necessarily dirty, but if someone has had their forward progress stopped by two players for a long time,
Everyone thought this was on Twitter. Yeah. So. No. I mean, go ahead and explain it, but everyone is with you. This was you're talking about the Devonta Smith.
The officials have to blow the whistle earlier on these plays. I mean, it's a dirty play, I think, by the defense. It's completely unnecessary. And yet,
that was bad. That was really bad. And I saw a lot of, I didn't mean to cut you off. I apologize. But I saw a lot of comments on it, and I guess a good way that people responded that way. I suppose that happens a lot with the offensive players, and we're all kind of protective of them in fantasy. But yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off from your point, but he was moving back toward the line of scrimmage. The play was dead, and you got a lineman coming from the line of scrimmage and just going headhunting at a wide receiver who's like not even in the play anymore. He's being dragged backward. I mean, that guy should have been ejected. Was he ejected? I think I saw the play after the fact. They didn't even call a penalty on it.
No, I don't think so.
I mean, it's just a really, really ridiculous moment. One of the really unfortunate moments of the day. You get a guy knocked out of the game, right? I mean, I saw he was in the concussion protocol.
As soon as he was sandwiched by those guys, the helmet came off, the ball, like his arms went limp, the ball comes out of his hands. I mean, it's a clear concussion. And again, I mean, these are situations where it's not just that they get knocked out of a game and don't get to continue. I mean, Trey McBride seemed pretty distraught that he wasn't going to be able to continue in the game. Again, you don't know if he really understood what was going on at that point. But the situation with Tua and a lot of these guys, could end their careers, and it's super bad for their long-term health. We should just go to the next thing that's exciting and fantasy relevant. But those plays were upsetting.
They are very exciting, upsetting. I almost said exciting. That's not the word that I meant to get to there. It's been a long day. But yeah, that was a disappointing, tough spot. Like you said, we should go to something a little bit more positive.
Then, the best play of the day, hook and ladder.
That was fun.
Amon-Ra St. Brown. In a day where so few teams can complete a pass, the Lions completed a pass, lateraled it to Jahmyr Gibbs, where one of the things that you love to see on this play is you actually got the ball into the hands of someone who might be the most electric player we've seen. I mean, maybe since Barry Sanders. The Lions have been bad for a long time, but they have had an embarrassment of riches in terms of getting to have Barry Sanders, getting to have Calvin Johnson. Now you have guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, who is not in these game plans, but you have Jameson Williams, but you have Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, again, this is a game where the Lions were like, what we could do to make this game close is we could give 23 touches. I say 23. It was actually 26 touches because he caught 3 passes as well to David Montgomery. But Jahmyr Gibbs with the ball in his hands, the most fun thing you can see in football, but also, if you're going to have 26 touches for David Montgomery, it's nice that you offset that with this one extraordinary play.
That was a really, really fun play. I'm looking through my notes. I think you said that very well. Don't have anything to add. I'm looking through my notes for some other fun things. Did we get the Bucky Irving takeover today?
Ooh,
I think we might have.
There were a lot of great plays by the great plays. There were a lot of very nice runs from Bucky Irving today. I think my favorite one, though, was like the 2-yard gain where there was nowhere actually to run forward. And so instead he beat the guy who was in front of him like 5 times. He never ran forward. So there was never going to be any actual yardage, but he made the guy miss like 5 different times. He beat him to the one side. And then instead of running forward, he's like, there's nobody there. I'm going to beat you to the other side. He got over there. The guy's like, run somewhere else so you stop embarrassing me. He's like, there's nowhere to go. I'm going to beat you again to the other side. And Bucky looked pretty good.
He looked really good. He made a guy miss in the backfield at one point with a side jump cut. And I was like, I'm just imagining Bucs fans wondering if that's legal based on what they've had to watch in the backfield the last couple of years. And somebody tweeted back to me, that Rachaad White's sitting on the sideline, and it was the Tim Robinson, I think you should leave clip where he's like, I don't think you can do that. Like, can he do that? I don't think he can do that. So that was pretty funny moment. White, 6 carries, 17 yards, 2.8 yards a carry. I've been writing this in signals. Part of our thesis with this, play was that he has been very poor as a runner, 3.6, 3.8 yards per carry each of the first 2 seasons, I believe it was. I've been writing that I think he's regressed. 2.1, 1.8, 2.8 today was actually his high. So far, he has not averaged 3 yards a carry in any individual game yet. He now has gotten 31 carries and recorded 66 rushing yards, 2.1 yards per carry across 3 games. He's been good in the passing game. We always talk about that, right? He was actually less effective in the passing game today than usual as well. And they seem to use Bucky a little bit more in the passing game. But again, Bucky has a really good day rushing. He ends up with 9 carries. White only gets 6. They kind of went more to Bucky as the game went on because it was pretty clear they needed. I mean, like, it's, if you watch these guys run, I know we say it a lot and we probably sound like haters, but if you watch them run, like Rachaad White doesn't even get back to the line of scrimmage, and you're talking about how Bucky's making dudes miss in the backfield like he's toying with them. He's not necessarily hyper explosive. We still have some concern with Bucky. And when he makes guys miss, whether he'll be a guy who can then go and get the yards, we always talk about those types of players, and I'm sure you have the same concern. Saw a little bit of that today, but it's just so night and day between what he's competing against in that backfield. We'll see where this goes, but yeah, Bucky winds up getting 3 targets as well and catches 3 passes. White still got 6 targets. I assume ran quite a few more routes. He caught 5 balls, but he only had 18 receiving yards as well.
He did seem like he was out there much, much more frequently in the receiving game. One of the things that you and I talked about a lot was that because Irving has been such a good receiver, that once he takes over as a rusher, you also kind of expect him to take over as a receiver. It's a little bit different, I think, at the NFL level where there is so much pass blocking involved, although on a couple of the snaps where he had that responsibility, he looked pretty good. So hopefully it moves in that direction. You mentioned that sometimes once he beats guys, maybe the long speed isn't there. Certainly he tested very poorly. That's why he fell out of favor in fantasy. That's one of the reasons that he dropped a little bit in the draft, although the Bucs liked him. They picked him, I think, ahead of where people thought they were going to, or a team was going to. He looked unbelievable today. He had a 32-yard gain. He did look like somebody who could actually turn some of these forced missed tackles, these evaded tackles, into big gains. He had a really nice play where he gets tackled at the 1-yard line. I mean, that's going to happen occasionally, but
a little end around.
You kind of remember in the back of your head those long plays where it's like, man, if you could have just gotten a little bit farther. I mean, he looked good, and it changed their offense around. I mean, this is a team that started 2-0. Almost certainly, going back through it, it was shocking that they beat the Lions last week. They were pretty dominated in that game that they did win.
They were, yeah.
They're probably going to be solid, but you have to go in that direction. He's so much fun to watch. So hopefully we get a little bit more of that.
I remember I wrote about that in signals. The Lions, I believe, outgained him like 500 yards or 200 and something yards last week. I mean, that was a really bad loss for the Lions ultimately. This is a game
managed to run a massive number of more plays and average like a yard per play more. You don't get that in a loss that often, especially if you don't have a bunch of egregious plays against you.
That's right. This game here, one caveat we do have to mention for the Rachaad White people who are, yelling at us through their podcast apps. They lost 26-7. And so as Bucky got more work in the second half, it was also when the game was sort of, I don't want to say out of hand, because it was 20-7 at half, and you started to get a lot more work in the third. Nobody scored in the third. The Broncos get 6 more points in the fourth. The Bucs don't score in the whole second half. Broncos wind up winning 26-7. There was a lot of possessions where they were using him a little more when they were down 13, and it was like, we need to get a spark and get back into this game. But it is worth noting that he got, he played a lot in a situation where they did lose, and maybe some people will feel like they'll go back to Rachaad White next game, when it's a closer game or what have you. That's teams have done stuff like that.
It's going to be tough,
before.
I think, though. I mean, as well as they've played in some circumstances, this was more your prototypical Baker Mayfield game where he throws 33 times. He doesn't average 5 yards per attempt. Good quarterbacks are throwing those types of games in, especially in the 2024 environment, but they weren't able to get Mike Evans involved at all. As good as the early part of the season has been for Chris Godwin, it's been an unmitigated disaster for Mike Evans. if they don't get him going and or don't get someone else involved, certainly you don't want to have 8 targets for the 47 yards to Cade Otton. That's not going to make your offense go.
Or 6 for 18 to White. I mean, 6 targets for 18, 3 yards per target to White. That's not great.
Yeah, you gotta get Mike Evans going. I don't really have any Mike Evans for this season. Some of these things were elements that I thought you had some risk of creating exposure to with Mike Evans. Having said all of that, though, you expect Mike Evans to do better than he did today. He's going to bounce back. He is going to be a little bit of a buy low, but the passing game just has to be a lot better. One of the things I thought was a little bit of an under the radar type of thing to keep in mind a little bit in the first couple of weeks when the Broncos lost and Bo Nix didn't play that well, but they didn't necessarily get blown out in either game. It's really, some of the things that are happening here are still actually pretty good for the Broncos. The Broncos may end up being a pretty good team. Their defense, I think, better than people are perhaps anticipating. They may have the ability to take out the opposing team's number one wide receiver, in which case, you do become a little bit more one-dimensional. This game would have been a massive blowout, except for that Javonte Williams fumble. It was a disastrous game for him, which is a bummer for us. Stopped at the goal line early on in the game.
He scored on the one, and then they review it, and they don't have any camera angles because they got the call wrong. But very clearly, I think on third down was in. And then they gave it to Jaleel on fourth for the touch.
So this was, I think, one of the weirdest plays that I've seen, where in NFL games, you always have like some angle. But Javonte Williams ran into the pile, and just there was no way to see what was happening. Based on where his body was, he was obviously in the end zone. I'm looking for the officials on either side to run in and signal touchdown. They never do for whatever reason, even though he had to be in. And then the review,
you watch the replay and you're like his lower half is all that's visible, but it stops at the half-yard line, and his upper half has to be going across the rest of the half-yard line and into the end zone.
But then as they were reviewing that play, what was the thesis or the theory, I should say, on like where he was carrying the ball? Because unless it was in his knees, it was a touchdown.
Right. And it's so funny, though, because you knew they weren't going to do it. I tweeted out, like, he clearly scored, but they're also not going to – this is one of those ones they're not going to overturn because they don't have an angle.
So the really cool thing, if you have some of both, or if you had some Jaleel McLaughlin in the game, it's not that cool because he also had a terrible game. But it was one of the greatest 4th and goal runs of all time. It wasn't a great play call. He did have the defender in front of him. He somehow manages to beat the guy who had him completely walled off like the 4-yard line. Beats the guy, gets the angle, scores.
He starts to do his little stutter step, and you're like, oh, this is one of those plays where he's going to lose 10 yards. Like DeAndre Swift when the Bears tried to run the option at the goal line, and he somehow lost even more yards. That was an unmitigated disaster. But he starts to do the little stutter step, and you're like, oh, he's going to lose like 6 yards on this play. But he got the defender to stop enough, and then it just kept going right around the corner on him. And you're like, ooh, Jaleel's quick. He's a fun watch.
It was an unbelievable run. I don't know if we're going to see, again, a 4th and goal, 4th and inches run that good all season. He did finish with 5 carries for 7 yards. So
the run game's not good.
Absolutely fantastic. Well, Ben, Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin finished with 10 carries for 19 yards. Tyler Beatty and Bo Nix combined for 117.
Yeah. Tyler Bidet was apparently the big thing on Twitter, and the announcer was saying it. He clarified that his name is pronounced bidet, like the bathroom thing.
I like the way that I say it.
I'm gonna call him Beatty from now on. This is one that I
he looked good. 43-yard gain. I don't know. I don't know. So, but the thing I do want to say here is the Bo Nix looked fantastic the whole game, but also he appears to have the most functional mobility of any of the young QBs. All throughout this game, showed great pocket awareness, was able to scramble and get first downs. He had a 22-yard gain. He had a rushing touchdown. One of the things that we talked about with him was that in 2022, the rushing numbers for him looked really, really good, to where you're thinking this is a mobile quarterback who's going to add something in fantasy. 2023, like 0 pressure. right? And 0 sacks and record-breaking completions. And people want to point out that they were very frequently underneath. They were. He also was fantastic when he did throw the ball down the field. I think it's going to be hard to tell when you're never under any pressure what you can do. And he didn't look great in the first 2 weeks. He looked fantastic with the ball in his hands today, understanding where the pressure was, understanding where the holes were. That's what you're looking for from the mobile QBs in 2024. Someone where when things aren't open, you can get the first down, you can keep the drive moving. 11 targets to Courtland Sutton. Courtland Sutton actually looked like he tried today. Still not a great fantasy performance, but he pulled in some balls where the defenders were all over him. I mean, when little Jordan Humphrey has 8 targets, you've got some work to do in terms of fleshing out your receiving core, but positives for the Broncos overall.
We're moving to more Troy Franklin. He had more work than Mims last week, which I thought was so funny because the Mims thing is constantly we're trying to find more work for him. And then it seemed like Franklin wasn't going to play at all this year because of Mims. And then right away by week 2, Franklin played more than Mims. And so you're able to get him on. Saw more of him today as well. 5 targets, 2 catches. They both were still underutilized. You need the speed element. We've talked about this on the show. I did see some snaps where both Franklin and Marv Mims were on the field together. And I was like, thank you. Just do something. Like put a little pressure on the defense. There's no excuse for having little Jordan Humphrey run this many routes and have 8 targets for 35 yards or 37 yards or whatever this is, sub 5 yards per target. You're not stretching the defense in any kind of way. It's not doing anything other than Sean Payton like size. Because like that's, again, a 2005 thing that he used to think, and it doesn't work in the modern NFL. And he's some of Sean Payton's offense makes a lot of sense in an NFL where they're taking away the explosives, and it's the West Coast, and it's a short passing. And it's part of the reason we were in on this Broncos team for a lot of reason is like not that he's that sharp, but that the evolution of the NFL made it so that his particular type of outdated offense actually makes a lot of sense in the current NFL. But the stuff that he's trying to do with like these like big bodied wide receivers just is another one of those reminders that like these coaches that are clearly over the hill, clearly have not shown an ability to be dynamic thinkers and successful. I don't know if that's fair to say about Payton. He obviously had a lot of success in New Orleans, but some of the other one, when I said that, I was starting to think about like Shane Waldron. How does this guy running an offense in 2024 after what he did in 2023? Like the retread thing is such an issue in the NFL. We know that to be a problem. The guys that haven't coached for a long time, you bring them back and you say, oh, Sean Payton's going to be this great coach. I do think his offense can find some success because of what the modern NFL is and the way that the defenses play. But this stuff with like little Jordan Humphrey is really frustrating. He's got to get Troy Franklin and Marvin Mims some speed, some of those elements out there. Smaller receivers thrive in the NFL. Is he watching the other team? Like there's new rules. There's a different sport here. This is not 2005.
I agree with that. I am concerned that, especially in the Mims case, that it's just he's a bust. They're going to need to bring in people from outside.
The fact that Franklin is moving ahead of him. Yeah. The fact that Franklin's moving ahead of him is concerning for Mims for sure. But Franklin should be playing way more than Humphrey then. Like if that's the case, then we need to move quickly to where Franklin's out there for 70% routes on, per drop back. Like he's got to be out there. You got to have that speed element out there.
Well, one of the things they talked a little bit about last week after they struggled in the loss to the Steelers was that they were trying to do too many things, too many packages, asking the players to do things they haven't done before and aren't comfortable with yet. I do think there's potentially a place for guys who know how to run the offense to be out there and execute. I just hope it doesn't last forever, because one of the things that we saw today, even on these successful passes to Courtland Sutton, there's no separation there. So you've got to be very precise. The ball has to come out early. It's got to be underneath. But in the early part of the game, you did see Nick's attack down the field somewhat successfully. That part kind of disappeared as the game went along. There's a lot to be excited about here. Obviously, I'm pretty biased as he's one of the guys that I thought the analysis actually suggested was going to be a good play. Anytime that someone plays well early, you grab one of the things that support that. It may very well be that that's not the case as we move forward. And it's also a situation where anytime that you're frustrated with the quarterback play, you want there to be more talent, but more talent doesn't necessarily solve the problems. As we saw today with the Houston Texans, a pretty good game for Stephon Diggs, didn't necessarily get the explosives. The Vikings were able to take Nico Collins away. And Ben, I mean, where was Tank Dell? The Texans appeared to
Where's
want.
he been the whole year?
Well, in the first 2 weeks, I think there were some near misses.
Yeah.
Today, it seemed like they went away from trying to be an explosive offense. We talked on the midweek show, which we got some nice feedback on. Anybody who chimed in on that, we really appreciate. But this idea that you're going to be able to manage the game, you're going to be able to control the clock, you're going to be able to do some of the things that you did in week 1 when you were going against basically a barely there rush defense. That's not going to be the case in a game at Minnesota. And you've got to be ready to play. And they came in with a game plan that had no chance of working. And
You've been talking to me.
I mean, it took until we got Davis Mills in garbage time to unlock some of these guys. Now, again, the defense is approaching it very differently once you're at that point. Yeah. But it shouldn't be something where Davis Mills comes in and suddenly you're getting rid of the ball quickly. You have all 3 of your receivers on the field. One of the things that the commentators mentioned early in the game, and Ben, if I misheard this, you can definitely correct me, but it was interesting, I thought, within the context of them not looking very explosive in the first 2 weeks and looking awful today, is that CJ Stroud had mentioned that last year he was basically just reacting, and that this year he understands a lot more of what's going on. It was similar to a comment that Patrick Mahomes made early in his career. And obviously you need these guys to evolve and become the combination of what they are and what, Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers on Thursday night, who looked pretty good, much better than he had to that point. You want those things, and yet there's a big part of you that's just like, go back to just reacting. You were so good before you thought you understood what was happening on the
field. Yeah, a funny way of mentioning that. Yeah, you mentioned to me last week, and then I don't know on what shows, but I think probably on the Sunday show last week that you were pretty concerned about the Texans. I thought it was maybe a little overkill. Yeah, they settled for some field goals, but it wasn't the end of the world kind of thing. They still beat the Bears. They maybe just knew that, look, the Bears weren't going to be a huge threat. Shane Waldron's offense wasn't really that scary, whatever. They beat the Bears last week. This is the game where I got there with you. I was thinking about it, and I was like, this is where Shawn's concern's been. Not saying that I wasn't concerned prior, but they were 2-0, and I felt like maybe, they just needed to be pushed a little bit. In this game, they got pushed. They're down 14-0 after one period. And you're like, all right, well, now we're going to see it. Now we're going to see CJ Stroud have to come out of his shell a little bit in the second and the third quarter of a game and really rack up some pass attempts and have a big pass game because they need to get back into this. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is still a game. They're down 14-0, and they're going to come back. They're going to tie this game. It's eventually going to be a close game late because they're the better team. They weren't even competitive. They lose 34-7. They never show that fight at all the whole day. And it does come back to a lot of what you just described. Doesn't feel like the offense is even really threatening. There's a lot of run calls at certain times where you're like, that's just a wasted play. And you know what's going to happen?
And there didn't end up being a lot of run calls in the total volume at the end. And I think some people are going to be like, well, they only ran the ball 14 times. 3 of those were CJ Stroud. What are you talking about? When you do it matters and amounts to capitulating at a key point. It doesn't matter what the total volume is. It's what you did in a certain time of the game.
Yeah, and I mean, I know a lot of them say, well, you can't have too much tendencies and these and that. But I mean, there were some bad spots with the run decisions. And one of the things that's going to come from this now is they're going to say, well, it was really tough for us without Joe Mixon. He's the guy that we brought in and we really felt like was the engine of our offense. And he ran for 150 yards in week 1. And that's the offense we want to be. And it's like, I had them as better in this game because Mixon was out. I picked them to win on the road for stealing lines. They did go pass heavy. They look like they certainly not like the pass offense from last year, as you were talking about the idea that Stroud felt more reactive last year and those things. I mean, it was a frustrating game. I don't even want a victory lap. The Diggs thing, of course, although of course, we've gotten a lot of feedback on Diggs that he was very clearly the number 3 and the third best receiver on the team. So I just want to point out 10 catches, 12 targets, led the team in volume. More catches than Nico and Tank combined in this one. Nico has been the clear number 1. Diggs going to get volume. Obviously, this is a a revenge game for him, a return to Minnesota. Maybe that had something to do with it to a certain degree. Not a ton of yards, only 94 yards with those 10 catches. But this
If
was
he
the whole
hadn't been out
point.
there, they might not have picked up a first down in this game.
Right. He was actually the thing that was keeping them moving a little bit. He had a good catch on a third down that was short of the sticks early, that he wiggled and got to the sticks and converted. And you're like, okay, let's get going. And then, they weren't able to get going. But you're right. He was like the key thing they did actually have going. But I was just kind of referencing back to week one. Everyone was worried about his air yards and this and that. And we were like, hey, in this role, there's going to be spots where he just racks up volume because of it a little bit. That's what we saw in this game. Obviously, a big PPR day for him, maybe less so for the people who aren't in the PPR formats and those types of things. But I assume even in like points per first down that he had some big first downs in this game. So that he had a pretty solid game. On the other side, Sam Darnold. When JJ McCarthy got hurt, I moved Justin Jefferson up. We talked about this on the show. Nick Mullins being the backup and being the insurance for if Darnold wasn't really good enough was going to be actually a positive for Jefferson with how much volume they threw with Mullins late last year. And Jefferson looked like, I think a much better spot at that point than a potential rookie quarterback. He was my wide receiver 3 for most of the end of draft season ahead of Chase. He has a good game here, 681 and a TD.
That might have all come in the first half. He had a couple of second half drops.
He did. I think he did have 0 catches in the second half. I think they mentioned that. He had a bad drop late. The Darnold thing is what I was going to say is after McCarthy got hurt, some people were saying that Darnold could be like a high-end QB2, maybe a low-end QB1 because of the Kevin O'Connell tendencies, because of all that stuff. And I more or less didn't see it on that side of it. I like the Jefferson side because if Darnold was bad, you had Mullins. Darnold looks good, very capable of running the offense. He only throws for 181 yards here, but 4 touchdowns. Jefferson catches 1. Aaron Jones catches 1, has a great day, also 100 rushing yards. Jalen Naylor finds the end zone without Jordan Addison for his 3rd game, reaching pay dirt. Darnold's got to be like leading the NFL in touchdown passes, right? I don't know that for a fact, but seems right. What's the deal with Sam Darnold, Shawn? Is he like a top 10 quarterback going forward? I think he has real fantasy value. I started him in a couple spots, and I'm pumped about it.
Yeah, you have to be excited. Anytime that someone is throwing 4 touchdowns in this day and age, you're pretty, not just excited, you're ecstatic. This is a game where he doesn't average 7 yards per attempt. He doesn't get to 200 yards passing. A lot of that is simply because the Houston Texans were so non-competitive. I do think that there is a tiny bit of risk that because Aaron Jones is so good and because the defense is it's one of the exciting stories if you care about things from a reality perspective, kind of early on in this season. Brian Flores doing a great job. He's one of those names where, pretty controversial for a wide number of reasons, but there's no question, I don't think, about how well he's doing coordinating this defense. Mostly what's happening with the Kansas City Chiefs is that they're evolving, they're struggling, they're playing poorly on offense outside of Rashee Rice. Some of what's happening there is they just now have so much confidence in their defense, which we saw, make several, huge plays at the end of the game tonight, that they're not doing some of the things they would have otherwise done. You see this game today where an offense that you expect to be explosive, like the Houston Texans, can't do anything. My concern for the Vikings would simply be that the volume won't be there. Now, having said that, this game could have easily gone another direction. Someone I know that you were excited about, Ben, Jalen Naylor, had another good game. He had another long touchdown called back by penalty. I can't remember off the top of my head if they scored on that drive or not, if that would have been a 5th touchdown or just, one of the ones that did happen organically as they kind of went through. But there were some additional plays in this game where Darnold looked good that don't show up. Sometimes you have those plays because your team committed penalties that helped you. But yeah, 27, 28, 29 teams can't get anybody open. The Minnesota Vikings have guys running free every play, and Sam Darnold is finding them. That's extremely good news for them as a reality team. It's also pretty cool for your fantasy squads. And he's
Yes.
someone where I mentioned in my dynasty rankings this week, even if they do go to JJ McCarthy next year, he, I think, has already played well enough that he's going to be one of these guys who is a starter now. And anytime you're drafted that early, you're still reasonably young. You go through this stretch. I mean, he's somebody you should be trying to pick up because now the career is basically put back in place. There's a long way to go, but you've got to be excited for him in the same way that, I mean, you're not going to get huge scores probably, but I mean, Geno was able to get DK Metcalf down the field again today. That one, I didn't watch the second half because the Miami Dolphins, without Tua, so dispiriting. But
one of the things we are seeing with some of these QBs is you get a guy who has a little bit of experience, has been in a couple different systems, has had to make some reads, has made some mistakes, and he's in a system with a good coordinator who's also, putting him in positions to succeed, and they're able to find some success. We saw Baker Mayfield obviously have that type of a resurgence. Darnold was only a 21-year-old rookie when he came in, very young. He's 27 right now, doesn't turn 28 till next June. He just turned 27. A lot of quarterbacks don't hit their prime until their early 30s. It's a different position in that regard. Other positions, we talk about 27 as old, but 27, reasonably young to maybe be starting a stretch of good play. Like, there's room for him to be good for 5, 6, 7 years at this point, or more if he's good enough to. But I would have a little bit of skepticism that he's that guy, but it's certainly plausible, right?
I thought you were getting ready to make a pitch for Zach Wilson.
God, no. He's definitely not that guy. But yeah, I mean, that's the idea, right? I think there's a certain skill set that is, one of the things that I have been trying to figure out, Shawn, and I wrote up a little bit in, I believe in Signals, or no, maybe we talked about it on the Thursday show a little. I don't know, but this idea that some of the more like drop back passers might actually get back in vogue a little bit, right? We've been moving towards the more mobile QBs, but a lot of them are like, RPO, one read and then run, or that's like sort of the idea. And like, now that defenses are so multiple and they're rolling after the snap and they're changing the view pre and post snap, these guys that have had to learn to play the position through getting through progressions at every stage, and that's a skill for them because that's what they've always needed. I do think that's probably a better fit for attacking these defenses because you're trying to find the space that's vacated by the rolling and all the things that the defenses are doing. You got to be able to get through some progressions and those things. I'm not saying Sam Darnold's good, but I think the way that he played quarterback his whole life, coming up through high school and college and everything, to the extent that he was good at one time, that he was drafted obviously in the top 5, was that type of play. And so if you ever see him succeed, I think it can succeed in a way that makes a lot of sense for how to attack these defenses right now.
Well, I mean, I have some concerns even about the prospect profile coming in for Darnold, but I mean, the other names that we've been talking about today, I mean, Andy Dalton being the tempo that they played with today Derek was Carr. Just so different. And yeah, Derek Carr had more of an off day today, but one of the things too is that there is, and I don't think this is necessarily unique to the passing quarterbacks, but there is a lot of potential downside or risk when you, from things that are outside of your control, of when you get a bad coordinator. If you don't have the game predicated on running, you're going to get benched. And then you've got to come back through by proving yourself over and over in practice, getting back into a starting position and being in a situation where the coordinator can get the job done, or else it never really happens. And there's going to be an arbitrariness to how that works with the passing QBs, but also how it works with the mobile QBs. So I was thinking the exact same thing. I think probably after some of the awesome notes you had on our Thursday show, anybody who has missed that, you can get that on the RotoViz radio airwaves. But this idea that because, and this isn't shocking. I mean, teams need to win. This is a production oriented setup, But because the teams need to win with their young quarterbacks right away, you need to get guys with some mobility that covers up for the fact that they're simply not going to be able to do what the veteran quarterbacks can do. So if you don't have the mobility, you're at a massive disadvantage to any team with a veteran quarterback. But because we have that emphasis, then you're bringing in a QB. And it was kind of this thing too. We did a show last year about the Tom Brady comments. You and I were both somewhat skeptical. I'm still skeptical at some of the things that he said, but I think we're both more open to it as well. This idea that you actually do need, if you want the NFL to work, if you want there to be passing volume in these games, you need to have some critical mass of QBs who can actually go out there and read the defense and make these passes. And what we're doing instead is bringing in so much of the opposite, simply because you have to have that to work in the short run, and you never get to the medium term. But then my secondary thought off of that, as I was watching Packers Titans today, is that there's an arbitrariness with how we evaluate the passing oriented QBs, but even more so with the scramble oriented QBs. There was no way to watch the game today and not think that Malik Willis was far better than Will Levis, but that also he looked better than some of the other higher profile scrambling quarterbacks. And the people who were raving about him coming out of college are like, yeah, that's what we were saying. Why did he fall so far? Why did the Titans not develop him? Not that he looks fantastic, but he did throw only 19 passes a day and goes for over 200 yards, also runs for 73 yards and a score, which is the part that you're hoping to get from an Anthony Richardson, that you're hoping to get from, say, a Trey Lance. I mean, the way that people are looking at Levis and Willis and Richardson and Lance, and maybe even arguably someone like a Caleb Williams, who certainly, if
Justin
he's going to
Fields,
right, the standards for those guys are all over the place in terms of what we expect and think is appropriate to be a starter and then remain a starter.
Yep. Geno's another guy I wanted to mention when we were talking about like Dalton and Carr and those guys. Just fits right in there, right? The guy that had to wait that you talked about that has to earn his. We've obviously talked a lot about Geno, but he's another one of those examples. It's fascinating. We definitely need better QB play overall. Oh, the other name I wanted to mention was Purdy, and just like coming out of nowhere, but being a certain type of player that I think is this distributor, or thought of as this distributor. Also has some mobility, whatever. He's has his people that think that everyone understates how good he is, but whatever. I think I mean it in a positive way. He gets through his progressions. He gets the ball where it needs to be. I think in a good way.
I think with Purdy, you could definitely make the case that he's sort of the Kamani Vital, where, I mean, we haven't seen Kamani yet. We don't really know about him, but one of the things we're talking about there is that you look at his prospect profile. If he had a different name on the jersey, he would have been drafted somewhere else. If Brock Purdy hadn't played for Iowa State, if he had played for somewhere better or more interesting or higher profile, I don't think there's any chance he would have lasted to where he lasted. But also, he had one of his worst seasons at the end, which is never good for the prospects.
That's right. Raphael had an interesting comment here. Should we bet on Michael Penix next year? We weren't super stoked on him as a prospect on the show. I have been thinking about that a little bit. I thought he looked better in the preseason than I anticipated him looking outside of that UW offense from college. I felt like he was actually sort of able to play his game a little bit. He only played one preseason game, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was like one drive in Miami. But I thought he looked good. I mean, he missed some throws. The accuracy stuff is a real concern, but he was able to stand in and deliver some balls down the field. I could see him being one that is a little bit of a surprise relative to like some of the analytics and some of the expectations. Because I do think he, in that passing offense he was in college, had to go through some progressions. A lot of it I think was schemed up, but a lot of it was, identifying stuff, pushing the ball in ways that I think can stress defenses. I think he'll be an interesting one. We'll see. I mean, I don't even know if he's going to start next year, right? Like, there's still a really decent possibility that Cousins plays 2 years before we ever see Penix. He's more on like Jordan Love track. But will be an interesting one down the line. What else you got? Any other big thoughts?
Well, what did you think of Malik Willis and the Packers today? You mentioned that Jaden Reed looked pretty good. Obviously, the issue there is just overall volume. We finally got the long pass play to Christian Watson. I think that if you have him on some teams, that maybe calms the heartbeat a little bit, thinking that he could eventually get something done once they go back to actually throwing the ball. The thing that jumped out to me today, and again, there's so much bias here that anybody who wants to discount this, I have no problem with, but it was very clear that Emmanuel Wilson is better than Josh Jacobs. And they actually had to go to Wilson in this game because Josh Jacobs was running in quicksand. And Wilson, he goes 12 for 50. He also has 2 for 35 and a touchdown as a receiver. You mentioned the Bucky Irving takeover. The Packers have invested too much in Josh Jacobs, although it's, I think, overstated in terms of how the contract is actually structured. Their ability to get away from him, that was one of the reasons why we liked Marshawn Lloyd. But if you don't have Emmanuel Wilson, I would add him. I do think he's going to be very involved from this point forward.
He looked great. Little screen pass where he took off. Again, such a clever offensive design from LaFleur today. He's one of the best coaches in the NFL. I mean, I think that's very clear. He's definitely got these guys, on the halves side of things. Even when he's got Malik Willis out there and there's going to be a lot of quarterback rushing and that there's going to be not a ton of passing and all of these things, you're like, man, like this, he's got a good coach. I mean, one of the things I mentioned earlier that I kind of talked you into a Dunze over Reed, and early in the 2 games, I'm watching the Waldron stuff and I'm going, God, I talked Shawn into a player on this offense over a guy in this other offense. I'm watching the other game and saying, I mean, Matt LaFleur's got his guys gaining yards and set up in good spots. Reed is making some plays. He's not getting huge volume, and that was my big case to you, was if one of these two has a big ceiling game, it's probably got to be a Dunze breaking out in the spot against the Colts. And he does wind up hitting on enough big plays and scoring a touchdown that it looks nice in the end. But halfway through that game, I'm like, I mean, Jaden Reed's just in a way better spot because he's actually in a functional offense, and that matters so much.
It does. We did get a massive difference in final air yards in the 2 offenses, which swamped all of that. And that was one of the reasons why we wanted to go in that direction with it. Man, Jaden Reed looks good. There have been so many injuries to players we have, injuries to players who affect the players we have, injuries to players we don't have at all, that we get bailed out by other people being injured. I say bailed out, obviously, in all these cases, we just would wish everyone were healthy. And we got to see how all the teams looked with all of their guys. One of the things being that when we talk about zero RB, when we talk about the running back dead zone, it's not a matter of injuries being the main thing. 2 of the backs that I was pretty skeptical of this year were Josh Jacobs and Tony Pollard. You had the big week 1 for them, and you're like, well, maybe I'm wrong, but also week 1 is when you would expect them to have their best games, especially if they have decent matchups. Not say best games, but you're in a much better position going in week 1. Ben, I know that you had some frustrations at some point with some of the discussion of those things. This whole conversation is just in its infancy as it relates to 2024. We have 2 more games to go still in week 3. There's a long way to go, but when you watch Tony Pollard today, I think back to, again, some of the research that Blair put out that I think is so good. I mean, Blair's work is among my very favorite. Spears has the 4 targets. He catches all 4. He goes for 54 yards. He has dynamism that jumps through the screen. He was the best player on their offense in so many cases last year. One of the problems that teams have is when they don't take the young guys from their own squads who play well and then emphasize them. This is a game in which Pollard rushes 6 times for 14 yards. He looks like a backup, or at least someone who is not as good a fit for what the Titans need in this offense as Spears. Now, Spears was coming off of the injury last week as well. He only gets the 2 carries in this game in part because they don't run the ball at all, which was kind of interesting when you think about how bad the Packers' run defense has been. That's more than a little bit of a red flag for Tennessee here. But I guess if you do have Spears on your rosters and you're kind of looking to midseason and what could develop, I think that you have to be excited that he looked so good in this game, and that just the player he's competing with is not gapping him, is not distancing himself and winning that job outright the way it looked like was possible for the first couple weeks.
That's a great note. I didn't see a lot of Spears. I'm making a note for myself to go back and watch it before stealing Signal's whole inside baseball there. Shawn gives me a great note. I make sure I go back and watch it. We're going to see what I thought of that, but I assume I'm going to agree entirely. DeAndre Hopkins looked good for them today, playing on a torn MCL, has a touchdown. We see Calvin Ridley's volume really dry up. Hopkins scores a touchdown, basically just out physicals his corner, just like pushes him off the spot, catches it, and then is like, I'm going to walk through you and get into the end zone. He's a really good football player, even though he's pretty clearly lost a step. It was fun to see him, get some of the old Hopkins production. He hasn't done anything, obviously, up to this point. But, yeah.
I said Will Levis looked pretty decent earlier outside of that pick six. That's also outside of the other thing that is actually very relevant for reality, which is the 8 sacks. And in many cases, he stepped into those sacks, which in some of the other cases, their offensive line was overwhelmed. But the pocket awareness was a little bit of a problem.
Yep, that was disappointing. What else did we get in this game? Nothing for Dontavian Wicks. Only 1 catch for Dobbs. I remember seeing that. Christian Watson makes a couple long catches. I think the big thing, look, we've had 2 Malik Willis games, but just want to reemphasize, Jaden Reed, it looks like you were incredibly right on, Shawn. He's very clearly their top receiving weapon. Very clearly a guy that they want to get the ball to. They give him 2 carries in this game. He gets 6 targets on only 19 pass attempts, which is a huge number. Catches 4 balls for 50 yards. Had 2 carries last week as well, and a few catches in a game where they threw even fewer passes. Week 1 obviously had the 2 long touchdowns, also had 1 called back. Looked absolutely dynamic in that Brazil game when Love was in the offense. Jaden Reed, to me, is one of those guys, like, if you're in a kind of casual league, you go out and you send trade offers for, like, it seems like an obvious go, buy low, if you will, that people aren't going to pay enough attention to the fact that Jordan Love hasn't played the last couple of weeks.
He looked good. He looked good. When he touches the ball, and it's that thing where it's both before the catch and after the catch, where he gets open at will. Maybe he doesn't play every play, but they also, the scheme genius that you were talking about for LaFleur, you can see most clearly with Reed, where I've seen some stats as well kind of coming into this game, which, we're just a couple of weeks in, but his average separation was just off the charts. Like, yeah, when you're that good, and then you have LaFleur designing these plays, many of which are specific to you to get you wide open. But then once the ball is in your hands, utterly electric as well, which is one of the reasons why they're giving him the carries. We had a little bit of that trying to manufacture some touches for Xavier Worthy, who didn't play particularly well tonight. We had a little bit of that in the Detroit game for Jamison Williams. I'm hoping that we continue to get, some of those things from those guys, but of the group, Jaden Daniels is the one who could just run away with things. Even with Love missing a big chunk of time here, I think you've got an outside shot at Jaden Daniels scoring 300 fantasy points this year.
That is a big number. You mentioned the Chiefs briefly there. We talked a little bit about Rice. We see a little bit more Kelsey in this game. Juju winds up scoring a TD. Not enough Worthy for our liking. Carson Steele. 3 carries. Yeah, did get some manufactured touches. Carson Steele, 17 carries, 72 rushing yards, catches a pass for 2 yards. His long was a 9-yard carry. A lot of it was like 2 3-yard carries. But the usage was strong. They used him a lot on the first drive. They used him on pass downs. It was better than I anticipated, frankly. basically used him like Pacheco. And P. Ryan it's been a little bit like, we don't think you're quite Jerick McKinnon. We don't quite trust you to the same degree. And maybe that's fair. P. Ryan doesn't look great to me right now.
No, he doesn't look great, but they do end up with the same yards per carry average, which I'm not pointing out as in any way definitive, but just something the team may feel like the difference in dynamism, maybe not that great. He ends up with 4 targets, which, if things break a little bit differently, maybe that's a more value team. Anytime that you have a back in this offense who can get 4 targets, you're thinking forward to the future that during the bye weeks, if you have another injury. I was feeling as I watched this game, though, that, neither of these guys are the answer. And even though we discussed in the midweek show that the peripherals last year for Kareem Hunt were really poor, I think that he's got a shot. I think players who are not on the roster could still factor into this team. I would just stay very fluid and very creative as you try and approach your running back bench just kind of across the board, not even specifying the Chiefs, but certainly as you're playing the Chiefs, be ready for things to change, because I think they still very much could. They did come out for the second half and very clearly try and get a pass to Kelsey to get him going there, but it was the Rashee Rice show. He gets the 14 targets. Ben, there was more focus today on just how good he is after the catch, which to a certain extent you're going to need to do some of those things. You're going to be put in position to do some of those things if you're catching everything more or less right at the line of scrimmage, which is some of what was the case last year. But you watch him play right now. One of the reasons that they drafted him and he was exciting as a draft pick is that he had been a very good college player. He'd actually thrived more than I think people gave him credit for at different target depths as a collegiate. And you can see the combination of kind of the size you probably want from NFL receivers at this point, where he's not too big, but you have some size along with just fantastic athleticism. I think that when we look at Rice, a lot of what people think is that this is a Patrick Mahomes manufactured type of guy, in part because they have no one else. And maybe that's an exaggeration. People understand that Rashee Rice, pretty decent football player, but he's fantastic. And he's more athletic, I think, than most of the receivers who are used in a similar way. If you have that athleticism and you have Patrick Mahomes, even though, again, this is another game, 217 yards, 5.6 yards per attempt for Mahomes. They still have a lot to work out. They would probably tell you that they've won enough Super Bowls that they're not that worried about that. But man, Rashee Rice, he's the whole offense right now. He looks so good.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that are commenting on the Chiefs right now as if they haven't looked like this in week 3 of a lot of recent seasons, and they have mostly figured it out. Not always in time for the fantasy playoffs, often in time for the real playoffs. Bijan Robinson, 16 carries, 31 yards today. I feel like he looks fantastic, but there's not a lot of room for him to go anywhere. He only catches 2 passes. He does get the TD, but a disappointing game, at least in the box score. I thought he looked better. I'm curious what your thoughts were on him.
Yeah, I think that he was also the culprit on the big previous. Well, he's the guy who is stopped at the end of the game there, where, the offensive line doesn't do their job. But Bijan Robinson, for a big back, has maybe the best lateral agility that you're going to ever see. And one of the things that happened in week 1, where I told you I wasn't very impressed, and then you go back and look at the charting numbers, and he's up among the league leaders in evaded tackles, doing a great job with broken tackles, doing a great job with forcing missed tackles. I think we're going to get some of that from this game as well. But one of the things is just, it's difficult to do much against the Chiefs. I thought Kirk Cousins did a nice job. Darnell Mooney, again, actually looked pretty dynamic. It was interesting this morning. I got a dynasty trade offer of Drake London and Cole Kmet for Rashee Rice, which, not that long ago would have been thought of as a pretty significant overpay, but I did have to decline. And again, the difference in explosiveness from those two players. Now, London had a pretty good game. It does do some boxing out, does score a touchdown, but the main thing that you're thinking as you're watching this game is that, and it really wasn't that many players they got involved, but when Darnell Mooney and Ray McLeod are the guys who are running free in space and look like they have the speed to make the offense work, I mean, Kyle Pitts had a 50-yard gain in this. We discussed playing him earlier. The player that we benched him for hasn't played yet, so we don't know how good or a bad play it was. But with the 5 targets, you just catch the 2. You have a terrible game even when you have a 50-yard gain. The Falcons are still early on in trying to make all of their new pieces mesh. When you think about the QB, you think about the new coaching staff. They don't look like they have it figured out to this point, and they have had some difficult matchups like the one tonight. I think that Bijan, and who does get the rushing touchdown. So again, even in bad games, you're managing some type of a floor. I do think that Bijan and Breece Hall are going to finish at the top of the running back group when all is said and done. But yeah, we want to see more scoring. I mean, this game on Sunday Night Football, we thought we were going to get a little bit more of a shootout. Only 12 points scored total in the second half, despite the fact that both teams are fighting for the victory. I thought that part was pretty disappointing. I thought the 2013 final for Detroit, Arizona, when they both go up and down the field to start the game and look really good, and you're thinking, we've got a lot of dynamism on both sides from a personnel perspective and from a coaching perspective, and then that potential shootout kind of gets short-circuited as well. It's just week 3, right? We're going to get some of these teams really going. Hopefully we're going to get some games that are more similar to the ones where garbage time did pay off a little bit. Some teams came back and got involved. You got the massive attempt numbers from a couple of the trailing teams. You love to see that. I guess kind of as we finish out here, Ben, I had wanted to mention a guy that we haven't talked a lot about, and in some ways isn't that relevant because he was priced in a way that I thought it was pretty efficient, right? He's probably not going to kill you if you don't have him. He's probably not going to win your league for you if you do. But the contrast between Jonathan Taylor and everything else that happened today for the Colts on offense was very stark. The long touchdown run from Taylor was one of the coolest ones you'll see, where on that one, you see everything that Taylor brings to the table when he's healthy, which was the extraordinary vision to start, waiting for the play to develop, this ability to get lateral and explode basically 5 yards completely sideways. But then it's not just that Jonathan Taylor is fast, it's that he is patient when the runs start. But then once he finds the hole, he gets up to top speed. I think this is especially unique in such a big back. He doesn't run that powerfully, and so I know that
but he runs compactly. It's powerful in its own way. It's like,
I mean, he scores the short yardage touchdown, so he ends up with the 2 scores. I mean, this is a big game for him today. But I'm blown away by how fast he gets up to top speed, and then what that top speed is, I mean, you're not going to catch him.
I know what you mean when you say it doesn't run powerfully, but yeah, everything you're saying that jumps off the screen, I definitely noticed it as well. He's such a fun running back to watch. I'm trying to think of I don't know. He just runs like he runs so like I used the word compactly. I was thinking of Maurice Jones-Drew. I was thinking of Adrian Peterson. Adrian Peterson was always a little more physical, I think. Maurice Jones-Drew's this like bowling ball. That's why he popped to mind. Neither of those is the right comp, but he's just, I don't know. Jonathan Taylor's a fun back to watch. He's physical without necessarily being physical because he's hard to bring down, right? Like there's a balance in there. That when I say compact, that's what I try to mean is he's not necessarily trying to run you over, but if you try to hit him, he's going to shed tackles pretty effectively. It's somewhat reminiscent of Saquon Barkley, Shawn, who looks like he's in his freaking prime right now. I mean, a long touchdown from him. That's a guy that's looked really great so far this year. We've talked about him a little bit on other Sunday night shows. Not a guy that we have exposure to, but if you were in on him, good call. I mean, he looks good. He looks fantastic. Another long touchdown run from him, and then he gets a short touchdown. Really efficient rushing day from him. Going to be tough to keep it all up on the rushing efficiency side, but the way he looks is definitely promising.
There are some mild concerns, I think, there in that Jalen Hurts is playing really, really poorly. And that has the potential to wash back on the rest of the guys, especially as they're dealing with some injuries. It was, I thought, hilarious. The play design, Kellen Moore has gotten a lot of criticism over the last several years. And I would hazard to say that a lot of it is pretty deserved. And I don't know that he deserves any credit for this, but on the 61-yard Dallas Goedert reception that sets up that winning score from Barkley that you mentioned, not only did they get the two Saints defenders who were responsible for the guys, they hit each other about as hard as you'll ever see defensive backs hit each other. But then a third guy was wiped out on that as well. They managed to run a very legal play with the receivers crossing that took out 3 New Orleans Saints defensive backs at the same time, which is obviously how you can get a 61-yard catch for Dallas Goedert.
That was one of those plays where you see what we've talked about, where you start on the cover 2 shell and then they play like back to front. We talked about this on Thursday, and they come crashing down. And so the safety is coming. He's clearly on Goedert from the moment of the snap, basically. Goedert starts running free on the shallow cross, like a drag route. And the safety is sprinting downhill to get there. And it's like clear that if he just can keep running there, that once Goedert catches his ball 2 yards downfield, this guy's going to close on him before he can even really turn upfield and bring him down. And yet the defender crossing the other direction, they just run right into each other. I mean, he's coming down hard and they just crash. I tweeted, Shawn, before they even broke it down on the replay, because I noticed it live, that it was like a Three Stooges routine, like how hard they hit each other and their bodies go flying. And then Goddard's just out the gate the other way. There's no one to stop him. He's just running for 60 yards. It's one of those things that, the way that I was thinking about it was like, we talked about how these defenses are more free flowing and there's less rules and they're trying to show one thing and do other things after the snap. And so the safety is the back right safety, and Goddard's starting on the right side of the field, but he runs a drag. And so he's running from the back right, from the quarterback's view, down hard and across to get to the shallow left, because that's where Goedert is headed. And that clearly is his responsibility to go head off Goedert. And so he's knifing diagonally through the middle of the field at full speed. And it's those types of things that teams are not accounting for, because this guy shouldn't be over here. Like, the quarterback is seeing it pre-snap, and this is the safety over here. And he's not going to come into the play if I look off these defenders and this linebacker and I get Goedert the ball here. He's going to have room to run over there. But these teams are like, we're going to bring this safety all the way across the field down over here before you're ready for it. But he just runs right into another guy.
I just keep laughing because in my head on a loop, I'm seeing those guys.
They just go flying,
crashing into each other.
I mean, that's the hard part of it a little bit, is there's a little choreography. If you're just going to run guys across the field to confuse everyone, you got to not run into each other. I'm surprised we don't see more of it on it. Like, it was sort of the way that I was thinking about it. Like, how does this not happen more, the way that they're running guys down and around all the time? And then you have guys chasing routes, right? So like the defender he runs into is chasing another cross. There's a little bit of a mesh there.
There was a third guy who managed to get involved.
Yeah.
Then this is cherry picking it a little bit to, kind of make the point or talk about it or what have you. But this is a game where Derek Carr throws for 142 yards, where Alvin Kamara averages 3.3 yards per attempt on 26 carries. The game plan in that element or that area did not make sense. Where simultaneously Barkley, as you mentioned, goes 17 for 147. A lot of that comes on the big play. And the big plays are important. That's the reason to like Saquon Barkley. The boom numbers are the one area of his peripherals that have held up throughout. But also 10 for 170 with Dallas Goedert. You could probably look at that as a pretty big red flag for the Eagles. But with those numbers that I just mentioned to you, the Saints should have still won this game. I mean, there are a lot of problems that the Eagles are dealing with, especially if Devontae Smith is now injured. We mentioned it on Thursday a little bit, the buy low that everybody knows about, so it's not really a buy low. Chris Olave played very good game today. Catches all 6 targets, goes for 86 yards, gets the touchdowns. He looked good. Rashid Shaheed, 0 on his 5. You're going to get that with him. You knew that coming in. He did have 2 end zone targets that were really close. I mean, this could have been another big game for him. If you're in a start-sit kind of environment with him, it's going to be tricky, but you should be encouraged by the fact that actually it was very close to a 3rd consecutive big game.
Yeah, he's a tricky one. I have him on my team with Evan Silva. Silva's a big Shaheed guy, so he's pumped the first couple weeks. We got him in the lineup today over Jalen Waddle. I've always been giving him crap. We've been, we go back and forth on the guys that I like and that he likes and those types of things. So not that I'm happy that we got a 0. I was more thinking,
but it sounds like you're rooting against yourself in order to.
No, it's more like this is why I don't draft these types of players. Like, this makes it challenging. You stick them in the lineup at the wrong time, then they get back to the bench and they have another big game on the bench. It's the Gabe Davis problem all over again. But no, that was. Shaheed's off to a fast start, and like you said, had the potential for another big game here. Maybe he'll just string together a lot of big games. One of the things about the boom bust guys we talked about in the past is they're either boom bust or they're studs, depending on how frequent their down games are, right? If they're able to consistently do it, then you stop calling them boom bust. Like the game this week won't matter as much unless it becomes a problem. That's when you become Gabe Davis, is when it happens more often than the booms are happening. Get enough booms, you're just good. So anyway, we'll see how his season goes.
Yeah, and there is still the potential for some of those guys to emerge as stars, as you said. There's still the potential for some of the players to become disappointing. I was thinking about that as you were talking about it, that, Jamison Williams plus 2 yards today when you take into consideration his -7 as a rusher. Ben, that'll do it for tonight's live episode of Stealing Bananas. We got through basically all of the games and all the fun parts. So much fun doing this with you every Sunday night. Get to relive the excitement, get a little bit of that catharsis where we can talk out a few of the disappointments. There'll be plenty of additional notes during the week. We'll come up with a fun concept for you all on Thursday. Appreciate Ben doing such a great job with the show that we put out middle of last week. Be a lot more where that came from. This will be Stealing Bananas on Stealing Signals. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You all are here, so you know where to find it. But it's yards per Gretch. Ben mentioned stealing lines a couple times tonight. Don't miss out on the betting project with Alton Cates. Love to have you guys over at Rotoviz. The coupon code RB Radio 2024 for 10% off your 1-year subscription. We love y'all. We'll talk to you soon.